Before we dive into what might be the messiest decade in Anthrax's entire history, I need to make a correction. In the last episode, I completely skipped over an album, and a bunch of you called me out on it in the comments, so credit where credit is due. The album is The Greater of Two Evils, released in November 2004, and honestly, it deserves a mention before we go any further, because it's basically the bridge into everything we're about to talk about today. Here's the quick version. This wasn't a new Anthrax album, it was a re-recording project. 14 fan-voted tracks pulled from the band's early thrash catalog, songs originally sung by Neil Turbin and Joey Belladonna, but recut with John Bush on vocals. The whole thing was tracked live in the studio over just 2 brutal days, which honestly explains why it sounds as raw and aggressive as it does. And funnily enough, it almost had as much a ridiculous name. The working title was Metallum Maximum Aeternum, before cooler heads prevailed and they went with The Greater of Two Evils. Now, I'll be honest with you, going back and listening to this one, there are a few Bush versions I actually like more than the originals. His voice just hits differently on some of these tracks, more low-end grit, less of that classic high wail. If you haven't heard the record, it's worth listening. It's only a what-if snapshot of thrash-era Anthrax filtered through the Bush years. And that's really the perfect place to start today's story, because The Greater of Two Evils turned out to be the last studio recording of the John Bush era before everything blew up. What follows is, without exaggeration, one of the most chaotic stretches in Anthrax's history. 3 lead singers, multiple guitarists, a lawsuit, a secret NDA, and a reunion that imploded before a single new song got written. So let's get into it. In 2005, Anthrax did something huge. They brought back the classic Among the Living lineup for a massive world tour. Joey Belladonna back on vocals, then Spitz back on guitar, the whole 9 yards, and on paper it was a triumph. The shows were huge, fans got the reunion they'd been begging for, and the band even captured it on the live DVD, Alive 2. But behind the curtain, the reunion was less creative rebirth and more business necessity. Anthrax was in the middle of switching record labels, and a reunion tour gave them a clean way to fulfill old contractual obligations while generating some real momentum. There was also a somber catalyst. The shocking murder of Pantera guitarist Dimebag Darrell in December of 2004 hit the metal community hard, and Anthrax has said it made them realize life is short and they should get back together while everyone was still around to do it. But there's a problem. They jumped into the tour without actually sitting down and clearing the air first. Guitarist Scott Ian has openly admitted in interviews the band never really talked through their old grudges before hitting the road, and predictably, those old tensions came right back to the surface. By January 2007, the whole thing had collapsed. So why did Joey Belladonna walk away for a second time? By most accounts, he didn't actually want to. The breakdown came from a mix of contract disputes, financial disagreements, and simmering creative friction that never really got resolved. After the tour wrapped, the plan was to head to Chicago and start writing a genuine new album with the classic lineup, but the business and legal negotiations around that record and an upcoming major tour completely fell apart. Reports from both sides pointed to the same core issue: nobody could agree on finances or contract terms. The way it actually ended almost sadder than the dispute itself. In January 2007, Scott Ian put out a public statement saying Joey had decided not to move forward and that the old problems just couldn't be fixed. Belladonna, for his part, has claimed he actually found out the reunion was officially dead by reading about it on the internet. Same as the fans, not exactly a storybook ending for a dream reunion. With Joey out and guitarist Dan Spitz, he was also out as well. His reasoning was more straightforward. He wanted to make a real, definitive new album with a classic lineup, but the constant business gridlock, and specifically the inability to get Joey and the rest of the band aligned, made that impossible. Once Belladonna was gone, the surviving members decided to push forward with a brand new vocalist instead of trying to keep the classic lineup alive. Spitz wasn't interested in being part of that new direction, so he chose to step away entirely. And this is honestly one of my favorite footnotes in Anthrax history. Spitz didn't just quit music to sulk. He actually already left the industry once before, back in 1999, due to burnout, and reinvented himself as a Swiss certified luxury watchmaker. When the 2005 reunion fell apart, he simply went back to that career. From thrash metal riffs to precision Swiss timepieces, you don't get a career pivot much bigger than that. Quick housekeeping item here, because I know this one gets asked a lot. No, Rob Caggiano was not fired from Anthrax in 2005. He voluntarily stepped aside to make room for Dan Spitz and the classic lineup reunion. When the management and the founding members looked in the reunion plans, bringing back Spitz was part of the deal, and Caggiano's exit was framed as a mutual professional decision, not a firing over conflict or performance. He stepped down specifically so the Among the Living lineup could go do their world tour, and there was no bad blood in the process. In fact, that goodwill is exactly why, once the classic reunion dissolved in 2007, Caggiano was immediately welcomed back as the band's full-time lead guitarist. Now here's a twist a lot of casual fans don't know about. In early 2004, even before the 2005 reunion drama, bassist Frank Bello temporarily left Anthrax to join the newly reformed alternative metal band Helmet. By that point, after 20 straight years of touring and recording together, the relationship between Bello and the other core Anthrax members had gotten seriously strained. Bello has said the band was constantly arguing, burning out, and dealing with bad management deals on top of it all. He's compared the whole situation to a marriage. Both he and the band just desperately needed a break from each other. So roughly for a year, Bello stepped away, and Anthrax brought in a replacement we'll get to in a second. Meanwhile, Bello spent that year with Helmet, playing alongside Page Hamilton, guitarist Chris Traynor, and drummer John Tempesta. And it wasn't just a paycheck gig. Hamilton actually made him change his entire playing style, forcing him to play with a pick instead of his natural fingerstyle technique. Bello has credited that stretch with making him a significantly better, more well-rounded bass player by the time he came back in 2005. Right as the classic reunion was heating up.
Behind Anthrax, because obviously you played with the guys. What is it about Scotty and it makes him so...
So, who filled Bello's spot during that year away? That would be Joey Vera, longtime bassist of Armored Saint, and conveniently, a bandmate of John Bush's going back all the way to Armored Saint. He was the obvious trusted choice. Vera covered Anthrax's touring duties from roughly April 2004 to April 2005, keeping the band active during a genuinely vulnerable stretch right after We've Come For You All. Thanks to his deep background in thrash and traditional heavy metal, he integrated into that demanding catalog almost seamlessly, and he committed to a full year of heavy global touring, so the band didn't have to cancel a single date. He was always treated purely as a fill-in, never a permanent replacement, a safety net, not a successor. But Vera's fingerprints on this era go deeper than touring. Remember, The Greater of Two Evils, the album we opened with, Vera actually ran those vocal sessions with John Bush out of his own home studio, The Bridge, helping guide Bush toward a heavier, modern reinterpretation of the old Belladonna and Turban tracks. And his relationship with the band didn't end there either. Even after Bello returned in 2005, Vera remained the band's unofficial go-to substitute for years afterwards, including stepping in for a Montreal festival date and again in February 2012, when both Bello and drummer Charlie Benante needed personal leave due to family illness. Now, we get to one of the strangest chapters in the whole story. With Belladonna and Spitz gone in 2007, Anthrax needed a new frontman, and they found him in the most 2007 way imaginable, MySpace. Dan Nelson was a completely unknown singer from Long Island. Encouraged by his wife, he messaged guitarist Rob Caggiano directly on MySpace to talk about a potential collaboration. Caggiano liked what he heard and invited Nelson out to Chicago to jam on a side project, and after a marathon 10-hour jam session, Caggiano told him flat out he should audition for the actual Anthrax frontman spot. Nelson auditioned in October 2007, and his powerful, gritty voice, frequently compared to John Bush's, blew the band away. He was officially announced the new singer that December. And here's the part that really matters historically. Even though Nelson never got an official studio album release with his vocals intact, his fingerprints are all over what would become worship music, which I'll do a video on later on. He spent nearly 2 decades writing, touring, and recording a complete early version of the album, and he ended up co-writing 8 of the tracks that made the final release, including Fight 'Em Till You Can't and Grammy-nominated I'm Alive, which was originally titled Vampires. Along the way, he also fronted the band for the first ever shows in countries like Colombia, South Korea, and Estonia. This is where things get genuinely messy, because depending on who you ask, you get 2 completely different stories. In July 2009, Anthrax abruptly canceled a major European tour. The initial explanation was that Nelson had suddenly fallen ill, but shortly after, Scott Ian publicly claimed that Nelson had actually said the words, "I quit," during a moment of severe band tension, and that the band had simply accepted his resignation. Later interviews from band members went further, describing him as someone with a habit of quitting and even calling him a professional bully. Nelson's side of the story is almost a mirror image. He immediately fired back publicly, insisting he was never seriously ill and was fully ready to tour. According to him, the band was the one who unilaterally canceled the dates, used the illness story as a cover, and then decided on their own that he'd quit, when in reality, he says he was pushed out. The fallout from this got legal fast. Furious over the band's public comments, Nelson filed a $2.65 million lawsuit in 2011 targeting Anthrax for defamation and unpaid songwriting royalties from worship music. In 2012, both sides reached a confidential out-of-court settlement. And because of the non-disclosure agreement tied to it, neither Scott Ian nor Dan Nelson can legally talk about what actually happened during that chaotic week in July 2009. So officially, we will never know the full truth. With Nelson suddenly gone and a headline slot in the massive Sonisphere Festival in the UK just days away, Anthrax was in crisis mode, so they turned to John Bush. They didn't ask him to permanently rejoin, knowing how hurt he'd been getting pushed aside for the 2005 reunion. The band instead pitched him something much smaller, a one-off emergency performance, just to save the show for the band's reputation. Out of loyalty and respect, Bush agreed to bail them out for that single Sonisphere date in August 2009. It went so well that the band convinced him to extend his stay, offering up a run of high-profile international dates, including Loud Park Festival in Japan. Framed as a fun, illuminated victory lap rather than an open-ended commitment, Bush agreed to stick around early through 2010. But a full permanent return never happened, and the reasons why are honestly pretty revealing. The band wanted Bush to go into the studio and simply re-record the vocal tracks Dan Nelson had already written for worship music. Bush wanted no part of that. He'd always been a primary songwriter in Anthrax, and the idea of becoming a glorified session singer for someone else's material didn't sit right with him. In interviews, he admitted that because he wasn't doing it out of love of his soul, he threw out an intentionally outrageous financial number to record the tracks, a demand that reportedly caused a massive shouting match and left drummer Joey Belladonna really pissed off. On top of that, Bush has settled into a comfortable life in Los Angeles, doing lucrative voiceover work, including, of all things, a Burger King commercial, which I actually looked for online. I couldn't find it, but simply had no appetite for the brutal, non-stop touring grind Anthrax required. By May 2010, it was clear Bush was never going to fully commit, so Anthrax made the call. It would finally stabilize the band. For the next decade, they brought back Joey Belladonna, for good this time, to finish worship music and step into the Big Four era. That's where I'm going to leave things today, but the story isn't over. The next episode, I need to pick up back and go back with SOD in 2007. They released Rise of the Infidels. It's more of an extended EP with only a few new songs, but I really need to close out that chapter, everything that happened with the band and Billy Milano and all that. But then I'm going back to Joey Belladonna with worship music and that album and him coming back and all that. So check out the playlist. Should be on the screen right now. Has all the episodes in the Anthrax story. And I'll probably be closing this out within the next 2 weeks. There's also a poll on my community tab talking about another series I'm thinking of doing, and at the time of this recording, it looks like Flotsam and Jetsam is in lead, but you can go back and find that and vote on that. So, thanks for watching. See you in the next one.